The day I came home, I wore my injuries like a confession nobody asked to hear. A limp in my left leg that the doctors said would improve with time. A scar along my forearm that had already stopped hurting, but still caught strangers' eyes on the bus. I was 29 years old, and I felt like something much older. 10 years of service will do that to a person. 10 years of desert heat and long silences and sending every spare dollar back to a family I believed was waiting for me. I thought coming home would feel like exhaling. I had built the moment in my head so many times it had become a kind of anchor. The image of my parents opening the door, seeing my face and pulling me in regardless of the limp, regardless of the scar, regardless of everything. My father opened the door. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at my leg, then back at my face. "You're just a burden now, Soraya. Get out." He closed the door. I stood on that porch and felt something inside me go very, very still. I didn't know it yet, but that door closing was the first honest thing my father had done in 10 years. Let me tell you who I was before all of this, so you understand what it cost me to give them everything. I grew up in a house that was always slightly too small for the weight of things left unsaid. My father worked construction. My mother managed the household with the particular exhausted precision of a woman who has been stretching insufficient money for too long. I was the eldest. I had a younger sister named Dina who was 7 years behind me in age and several worlds behind me in responsibility, through no fault of her own. We weren't poor enough for anyone to notice. We were the kind of family that looked fine from the outside and felt precarious from the inside. The kind where you learn early not to ask for things because asking creates a pressure nobody needs. When I was 19, I enlisted. Not because I was running away. I want to be clear about that. I enlisted because I had done the math. A reliable paycheck, housing covered, and the genuine possibility that I could send money home and ease that permanent low-level tension that had lived in our kitchen for as long as I could remember. Before I left, my father sat across from me at that kitchen table, and we had a conversation I have replayed in my head 1,000 times since. He said the family would struggle without my income contribution, small as it was. He asked if I would send money when I could. I said yes. He said he would keep careful track of everything, that it was a loan the family owed me, and that when I came home they would make it right. He used that word. Loan. I trusted him. He was my father. I signed nothing because you don't sign contracts with your own family. You just believe them. That belief was the most expensive mistake I ever made. The first 2 years were exactly what I had hoped for. The calls home were warm. My mother cried hearing my voice. My father gave me updates, the car paid off, the electric bill cleared, a small debt settled. I felt the relief of it across thousands of miles. I was doing something real, something that mattered to people I loved. Around year 3, the updates stopped. Not the calls. The calls continued. But my father stopped mentioning the money specifically. Stopped referencing the loan, the running total, the plan to repay. When I brought it up once, gently, not accusingly, he said everything was being tracked and I shouldn't worry. His tone carried just enough authority that I let it go. I was busy. I was deployed. Worrying about finances felt small against the backdrop of where I was and what I was doing. So I kept sending. And I kept trusting. But something had shifted and I could feel it the way you feel weather changing, not yet visible, but in the air. Year 5, my mother mentioned in passing that they were thinking about investing. A rental property, she said, in the next town over. A smart move for the family's future. I remember feeling a flicker of something, not quite suspicion, more like surprise. I hadn't known they had that kind of money sitting available. But I told myself that my contributions had helped them stabilize and maybe they had saved carefully. I wanted that to be true, so I let myself believe it. Year 6, I called home and the background sound was different. Bigger. More echo than I remembered. My mother said they had done some renovation work. Nothing major, she said. Year 7, my sister posted photographs online. A vacation. Blue water. My parents in sunglasses on a wooden deck attached to a house that looked nothing like the house I grew up in. I stared at those photographs for a very long time. Then I did what I had trained myself to do for years. I put the feeling down. I went back to work. The version of me that existed then was still trying to protect the story. But the story was already rotten underneath. Year 9, I was injured. I won't detail the operation or the location. What I will say is that it happened fast, and the recovery was slow, and I had more time lying in that medical facility than I had ever had in my life to think about things I had been disciplining myself not to think about. The rental property, the renovation, the vacation. The way my father went quiet on the phone whenever I asked about the loan. The way my mother had stopped saying the word altogether. I was not naive. I had simply been choosing, very deliberately, not to follow certain thoughts to their conclusions. Because the conclusions were too large and too painful, and I had been far away with no way to act on them. But lying there with my leg in a brace and nothing to do but think, I finally let myself follow them all the way. By the time I received my medical discharge papers, I had already arrived at a truth I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. But I knew it. The way you know things before you can prove them. I got on the plane. I told myself to wait and see. I told myself that perhaps my father would open that door and the sight of me would remind him of who I was to him, of the promise he had made at that kitchen table 10 years ago. I took the bus from the station. I walked up to the house, and it was a different house now, I could see that clearly. Extended at the back, new windows, new facade. A house rebuilt on a foundation I had laid. I knocked. My father answered. He looked at my limp. He looked at my scar. And I saw something in his eyes I had not expected. Not cruelty. Calculation. He had known I was coming home. He had known the paychecks were ending. And he had known that a Soraya who was home permanently, who was no longer exhausted and distant and willing to let things go, was a Soraya who would start asking questions he could not answer. Throwing me out wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a strategy. Get me gone before I started looking too closely. You're just a burden now. Get out. He closed the door. I stood there long enough to understand exactly what had just happened. Then I picked up my bag and I walked back to the bus stop and I bought a ticket south. 2 hours down, at the edge of a county with more fields than people, my grandfather lived on a farm he had worked for 40 years. I had nowhere else to go. What I did not know is that my grandfather had been waiting for exactly this moment. And that he had not been waiting empty-handed. The farm looked the way it always had. Unhurried. Solid. The kind of place that has no interest in pretending to be anything other than exactly what it is. I walked the dirt path with my bag on my shoulder and the ache in my leg that came on after long days, and when my grandfather stepped out onto the porch and saw me, he went very still. He looked at me for a long moment. Not the way my father had looked at me. There was no calculation in it. There was just the face of an old man who had been worried for a very long time and was relieved to see the person he had been worried about still standing. Then something else moved across his expression. Something harder. Something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed out. He came down the steps and put both hands on my face and said, "I was afraid he'd find a reason to keep you away." I didn't understand that yet. I just let him bring me inside. He fed me. He asked about my leg, about the discharge, about the journey. Normal questions asked with deep gentleness. But underneath the gentleness was a man who was working up to something. I could feel it the way you feel tension in a room before anyone has spoken the difficult thing. After we ate, he got up without a word, went to the back room, and returned carrying a thick manila folder. The metal clasp at the top was worn. The edges were soft with age. He had opened this folder many times. He set it on the table between us. "You never wondered," he said, "why your parents suddenly got rich?" And there it was. The question I had been refusing to ask myself for 5 years. "Show me," I said. My grandfather had been the family's bookkeeper for decades. Not professionally, practically. He was the one relatives called when they needed help with accounts, tax paperwork, property documents. He was precise, and he was trusted, and he had been quietly keeping records since long before I enlisted. When my parents asked him, in my 3rd year of service, to help them manage a property purchase, he agreed. And he kept copies of everything. Every document. Every transfer record he was shown. Every email correspondence he was included in. All of it filed carefully in that worn manila folder, dated and annotated in his slanted handwriting. Because something had felt wrong to him from the beginning. And my grandfather was the kind of man who, when something felt wrong, wrote it down. He walked me through it piece by piece. Year 3 of my service, my parents had approached him to help structure the purchase of a rental property in the next town. They told him they had been saving carefully and had accumulated the funds themselves. He had his doubts. He knew what my father earned. He knew what savings were realistic, but he processed the paperwork. And he kept copies. Year 5, they renovated the family home. Extensively. He saw the invoices. He did the math. The numbers did not match what two people on modest incomes could accumulate even with careful saving. He made notes in the ledger. Year 7, my father came to him again, this time to help set up a small business. My grandfather asked, directly, where the capital was coming from. My father said it was accumulated family savings and an informal arrangement with a relative. He would not say which relative. My grandfather wrote that down too. He had no proof of what he suspected. Not yet. What he had was a pattern, carefully documented, waiting for context. The context was sitting across the table from him now. You told me before you left, he said quietly, that your father had asked you to send money home as a loan. That he promised to repay you. Yes, I said. Did you put that in writing? No. He was my father. My grandfather nodded slowly. They told everyone it was a gift. That you were generous and you gave freely, and there was never any expectation of return. He looked at me steadily. But I never believed that. Because I knew you. And I knew him. The word loan. My father had used it deliberately at that kitchen table. And then spent 10 years telling everyone a different story. That was not a misunderstanding. That was a lie told in 2 directions at once. A lie that had a legal name. I spent 4 days on that farm before I moved. I slept properly for the first time in months. I let my leg rest. And I thought with a cold, careful precision, I had developed over 10 years of situations where panic was a luxury you could not afford. On the 5th day, I called a lawyer. I had researched carefully a civil attorney with specific experience in financial fraud and exploitation cases. I told her everything. I brought my grandfather's folder. I brought 10 years of my own bank transfer records showing every payment I had made, every amount, every date. I brought written testimony from my grandfather detailing every document he had been shown and every conversation he had recorded. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "The loan framing is your foundation. Your father established a loan agreement verbally and then spent a decade misrepresenting it as a gift to third parties while spending the principal and generating profit from it. That is fraudulent misrepresentation. The profits generated rental income, business revenue, are traceable to funds obtained under false pretenses. That opens both civil and criminal exposure." She paused. The property purchase is where it gets especially interesting. When your father structured the rental property under your mother's maiden name and told your grandfather the capital came from personal savings, while simultaneously telling you the money was being carefully tracked as a loan, that is active concealment. Depending on how the financial reporting was handled, there may be tax implications as well. I said, "Do everything available to you." She said, "I intend to." They had built their comfortable life on a foundation of carefully maintained lies. What they had not counted on was a grandfather who wrote everything down. My parents were served 6 weeks later. The civil suit was specific and thoroughly documented. Fraudulent misrepresentation of a loan agreement. Unjust enrichment through funds obtained under false pretenses. Damages calculated to include the rental property's purchase value, 7 years of rental income, the cost of home renovations, and the traceable capital used to establish my father's business. My father's response, through his attorney, was exactly what my lawyer had predicted. He claimed the money had always been a gift, that I had given freely and voluntarily with no expectation of return. My lawyer had anticipated this. She presented the testimony, my grandfather's detailed ledger, the documented conversations, the timeline of my father's statements to different people at different times. She presented the property structuring under my mother's maiden name as evidence of deliberate concealment. She presented the business registration documents showing capital origin inconsistencies. The civil case built its own momentum. But it was the tax authority referral that changed everything. When my lawyer flagged the rental income and business capital discrepancies to the relevant financial authorities, an independent investigation opened. My parents had not declared the rental income correctly across several years. The property structuring had been done in a way that raised specific questions about intent. My father's business had inconsistencies in its registered capital sources. These were not questions my lawyer raised. These were questions the investigators arrived at themselves following the documents. My mother was formally charged with financial misreporting. She accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial. My father avoided criminal charges but was required to cooperate fully with investigators, a process that made his business records entirely public. His business partners saw everything. His suppliers saw everything. The community he had carefully cultivated a reputation within saw everything. The civil case settled 11 months after I first walked into my lawyer's office. My parents did not take it to trial. The evidence was too clean. The documentation was too complete. My grandfather had spent years writing things down with the patience of a man who believed that truth, properly kept, would eventually find its moment. Its moment had arrived. The settlement required full repayment of the calculated damages. The rental property was sold. The proceeds went toward the judgment. My father's business, every brick of it built on capital extracted from my service pay under false pretenses, was liquidated to cover the remainder. The renovated family home, the one I had watched transform in photographs while I slept on base bunks overseas, was put on the market. Everything they had constructed on top of my decade of sacrifice was methodically taken apart by the same legal system I had spent 10 years serving. My father's reputation did not survive the public records. His business contacts withdrew. The carefully maintained image of a self-made man collapsed under the weight of documents that told a different story. He had not built anything. He had held the ladder while his daughter climbed it and then pulled the ladder up behind him. My sister Dina called me once during the proceedings. I have thought about that call many times since. She had accepted an education she believed her parents had provided. I don't know how much she knew. I may never know, but I did not answer. Some doors, once they have been closed in a certain way, do not need to be reopened. My grandfather signed the farm over to me the following spring. He said he had been planning to do it for years and had simply been waiting until I had somewhere solid to stand first. I stood on that porch on the morning the paperwork was finalized. The field stretched out in front of me unhurried and unchanged, the way they always had. And I felt, for the first time since I was 19 years old and signing papers at a folding table, that the ground beneath my feet actually belonged to me. I had served my country. I had served my family. I had given every dollar and every year and eventually my own body to people I believed were worth the sacrifice. They were not, but I was. I always had been. They didn't just lose me. They lost every wall they had built using my name, my service, and my silence. And when the last document was signed and the last asset was gone, nothing remained of what they had stolen. Not one brick. Not $1. Not one lie left standing.